Greetings and salutations. My name is Michael Schwahn, I'm the nerd in a snapback, and today we are going to talk about my most forgettable games of 2022. I actually got to play a lot of games this year. I think it ended up being something along the lines of like 50 or so games that I played in 2022, which was really great. Like, that made me really happy when I actually started building the list and going through everything, and I've split them into 5 lists that we will be talking about, but today is the forgettable ones. The other ones are the good, the bad, the ugly, and the memorable, but today let's start with the forgettable. Now, one of the things that's really important though is when I say that these games are forgettable, I do not mean that they are bad. There are some games that I would actually say are good on this list, but they are on this list because I don't think that outside of this video, I will really be talking about them again in the future, and for different reasons in each case. I have them broken into 10 sections, although a couple of them have multiple games in the same section. You'll kind of understand why as we get into them. So, let's get started. At number 10, we have Ender Lilies. Now, I played 50 games this year, but one of the only games that I started and then didn't finish was Ender Lilies. And it wasn't even because it was bad, it just didn't, hook me to a point where I just wanted to keep playing it. I've considered it, I've talked about it multiple times. We used to do a series where we just kept playing through Soulsians, and it was one of the ones on the list, and then it just kind of got thrown aside. It's not exactly your normal Soulsian in the way of that you're thinking of like Dark Souls or Bloodborne or Neo or Elden Ring or whatever. It's a 2D game, and we've seen a few of those. You see some 2D Soulsians in the form of like Salt and Sanctuary or Hollow Knight, and it's much more faithful to that idea that I think a game like Hollow Knight is. It's got beautiful art, it's got a cute MC, and I don't know why, but it just didn't hook me. And it's one of those things that I've even kept installed on Steam, and I look at it and I just have no desire to play it again. I'd have no desire to go back and finish it, even though I can't say I didn't like what I was playing, which I can say that about some of the other games, especially like Bloodstained Ritual of the Night, which was critically acclaimed, right? I played that before this year, and I just didn't like that game. I can't say I didn't like Ender Lilies, but every time I think about playing it, I just want to play something else. And that's why it's going to be my number 10 on my most forgettable games of 2022. So number 9, I have just listed as Phasmo clones. Phasmophobia came out, and there was immediately just this torrent of people that jumped into Phasmophobia, and they loved the ever-living bejesus out of Phasmophobia. And then it spawned, I don't know what to call them, investigative horror games, I don't know. But we've seen so many games come out that are trying to just copy Phasmophobia. Some of them do their own thing. Some of them mix it up a little bit. Some of them don't. Some of them just straight up copied Phasmophobia and then just did nothing new with the formula. I've played a lot of them this year. We played Ghost Watchers. We played Obsidio. We played Ghost Exile. We played Ghost Exorcism Incorporated. We played a lot. Now, one of the things that I'll say is that none of these games are necessarily bad, but none of them are also necessarily good either. And I don't even think Phasmophobia is good. I like the idea of these games, the concepts of being these ghost hunters, hunting legitimate ghosts or spirits or demons, and you got to use your tools to go in and find them and determine what kind of ghosts they are. But for the most part, the games are very formulaic. Once you have figured out how to solve the game loses so much of what makes it what it is. Like, when you first go into these games, you're like, man, this is kind of spooky. They did get a good job with making the environment kind of creepy. My back feels kind of tight. I got this tingly sensation. I don't like this. But then as soon as you solve the puzzle, the riddle of how to get the ghost to do what you want and how to get the evidence that you need, it becomes the most second grader, brain dead, use this tool, mark this down to go do this. This took a little bit too long. I'm dead. Oh, well, whatever. You guys can finish it off, right? I will touch a little bit on each of these games. So Obsidio is the one that I probably played the least, and that is because it had the least in it. However, it probably had the best atmosphere in it because they did things that were more unique in helping you try to identify what type of ghost it is. Things like the ghost cracking the walls and making the environment change and you're hallucinating and stuff. Things that were a little bit more than what we see in games like Phasmophobia, where, you know, you're just basically just relying on the tool for your interaction, or maybe you hear like a breath in your ear. Obsidio did more that made it feel like there was a larger presence than just this entity that existed on the property. Ghost Exorcism, I think, had the best mechanics of all of these. The tools worked better, and they gave you more tools, and the tools felt like they had purpose, and they had a level of weight to them to where you're trying to do these multiple pieces to be able to weaken the ghost to the point that you can actually get rid of it. Things like needing to read from a ritual book, or throw things at the ghost, or use different tools that make the ghost poof into smoke. And it feels good when you do them, especially because there is a risk to them in that you can fail. Like, you're like, I need to throw my holy water on the ghost. If you fuck it up, you don't got the holy water anymore. And in some cases, that means you're dead. And in other cases, it means that you just can't complete the mission because maybe you don't have the money or you didn't bring another holy water or whatever. Ghost Watchers, I feel, is better than Phasmophobia in like every way. It looks better, it runs better, the tools make more sense, they're more reliable. But the problem with Ghost Watchers is that everything is too reliable. It becomes super methodical, right? Everything, like we talked about how it's kind of like a second grade puzzle where you just need to check off boxes. Ghost Watchers is that to a T. Really cool ghosts. The ghosts look cool. They'll like drag you away and like drag you through the house. That's horrifying the first time that happens. But as soon as you understand the tools, the game loses all momentum. There is no more stress in it. It's just the most like checkboxy thing. You would swear you were doing inventory at retail. And then the last one is Ghost Exile. Now, Ghost Exile, the thing that I'm going to note here is that some of these games are like Phasmophobia, in which you go in, you find the ghost, and then you leave. Some of these games, you go in, you find the ghost, and then you are told to exorcise the ghost. And the way that you do these can be slightly differently from game to game. Sometimes you'll get the evidence, and then it'll tell you you need to take these steps and banish it. Ghost Exile, I think, is the game that had the best banishing mechanics. You would need to go in after you figured out how that kind of ghost it is, and you need to do things like draw ritual circles and you'd have to do a larger amount of setup to begin banishing, rather than like throw water on it, throw salt on it, and then, you know, hold a cross at it, and then it's done. There was work that you put in for Ghost Exile that felt meaningful. And even while you're doing the banishing, you got one person that their sole job is to read the book. They are reading the incantation to banish this ghost. And things are happening while the ghost is being banished. People got to run and close portals or maybe getting killed and stuff. It's good. But like all of the rest of these, it's so forgettable because once you have figured it out, it just falls into the same bucket as all of the rest of these ghost investigation games. They all have something that makes them unique and stand out, but they're all still just a different flavor of Phasmophobia. And that at the end of the day is not something that I personally will remember going forward really much past 2022. At number 8, we have Little Nightmares 2. Now, this is a prime example of what I talked about in the intro of games that are not bad, but are forgettable. And there's a very specific reason that I think that Little Nightmares 2 is forgettable. The largest being is that it is a sequel. Okay, I played Little Nightmares 1, I really liked Little Nightmares 1. Little Nightmares 2, I also really liked, but Little Nightmares 2 felt like more of Little Nightmares 1. They added a character, so now there's 2 characters that are running around instead of 1. This allows for new types of puzzles, but it didn't really change anything in terms of depth of mechanics. There are larger, more grandiose sections that are really cool, and they're really like neat moments, like the Pale City, and the city is bending around you, and you got the strange man or whatever his name trying to get at you, and the final boss, which I'm not going to talk about for spoiler reasons, is a really cool spectacle, but it just felt like more. And when I think back on Little Nightmares 2, it's hard for me to think of what was Little Nightmares 2 and what was Little Nightmares 1. And in a way, they kind of blend together, and they're both a lot of quality. But when I went to Little Nightmares 2, I was just thinking of Little Nightmares 1 and feeling like, okay, this is like this is like this. And when I look back at this in years to come, I will probably think of them together, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm remembering Little Nightmares 2. And the thing that was most defining for me was my experience in Little Nightmares 1, because it set so much of the tone and the energy and the atmosphere that existed within this world and this universe. And the sequel feeling like an extension of that rather than its own thing is fine, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it stands out on its own in a memorable way. And I'm not even sad that it doesn't do that, because I think if they tried to make the sequel stand out on its own, it would have felt too largely disconnected from Little Nightmares 1, but it does mean that it's going to end up on my forgettable games of 2022. Number 7 is Hyperlight Drifter. Now, this is an interesting prospect for me because Hyperlight Drifter is memorable for me not because of the game, but because of how I'm feeling about its sequel. And depending on how the sequel goes, I might feel differently about both games. But Hyperlight Drifter at its core is an isometric Dark Souls style game. It has really beautiful art, but here's the thing, is that I barely remember playing this game because it just didn't have a lot that was memorable in it. The thing that I remember is its art. It had beautiful pixel art environments, beautiful pixel art like sceneries and showcases, cool pixel art bosses, but the actual game itself, my brain goes, do you remember playing that? And I was like, I remember that we played it. What was your favorite part? I don't know. I remember that there's a dodge and a slash, and is there a ranged weapon? This is how little I remember this game, even for the sake of this video, is that I remember liking this game, I remember it being pretty, and I don't remember anything else about it. Now, I do have concerns about the sequel because, like we said, Hyperlight Drifter is an isometric Dark Souls game. Hyperlight Breaker, the sequel, is going to be a 3D roguelite action game, which Hyperlight Drifter was a linear, I'm not going to say linear experience, a storyboarded experience. You would go through and you'd play this game from beginning to end. You'd go through the bosses, you'd start, finish, roll credits. And roguelites are not that. And it's not that I don't like roguelites, I do, but it's just that when you came from a game that was not a roguelite and you're going into one, it does raise some concerns. But maybe the game will be good, maybe I'll remember it better, but for the time being, I don't remember much about Hyperlight Drifter. At number 6, we have Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, or Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. Now, I did a reaction to this already when it was coming out, and one of the things I will say is I don't agree with all of the hate that these games got. These games look great, and they play great. There's so many remakes that are coming out, and there's so many people that are upset that they're not getting one-to-one remakes. People are like, I want the exact same game, but I want it with better graphics and better visuals, and I want it to run better. And then they got that with Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, and they're like, this is the same, I hate it. Now, mind you, those might be completely different people talking, and there's a very decent chance that they are, but it doesn't change the fact that the internet made me want to claw my eyes out. Big surprise, I know, right? And it's not even just a one-to-one remake. It actually came with a lot of extras. There's a lot of extra stuff to do in Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl that weren't in the original games. And that's great. I thought it was fantastic. It definitely felt like, you know how when you think back on a game that you played as a child and you're like, man, I love that game. It looks so good. It was a lot of fun. And then you play it today and you're like, wow, that game looks awful and it plays like crap. Why did I like this? And the visual in your memory, the rose-colored glasses or the vagueness of what you're trying to remember is different from reality. When I went back and played Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Shining, well, when they came out and I was playing them, and it felt like it was taking me back, and I was playing them in a state that was like how I remembered. Because obviously if I go back and look at base Diamond and Pearl, they're not going to look as good as my brain thinks that they did. But playing Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, they did look as good as I was remembering, and that's because they were modern remakes. That said, Diamond and Pearl, in my opinion, are some of the weakest Pokemon games in the history of the franchise. Generation 4, I don't think is really good, okay? I thought that Generations 1 through 3, fantastic. 5, great. 6, 7, 8, and I didn't play 8, and now we're on 9 with Violet and Scarlet. So they are not great entries in a general sense, and that's why, like, even the thing that I remember about playing the originals was I was like, man, there's a lot of returning Pokemon, and this just isn't that interesting. Thankfully, Generation 5 with Black and White was fantastic, and that kind of just really reinvigorated the franchise for me when they came out. But it does mean that even though I do like these as products in terms of one-for-one remakes with better graphics and more stuff in them, that they are not going to be games that I remember for the foreseeable future. Not in the way that, like, Let's Go Eevee and Pikachu are, which are not necessarily one-to-one remakes of the original games, but that's what they're kind of trying to be, and I thought those games were fantastic. But what I will say, much to the dismay of people who do not like Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, I really hope that Black and White, or if they go with Black 2 and White 2, or if they call it, you know, Brightest White and Deepest Black, or whatever they call the Generation 5 remakes when they arrive, I hope that they get this treatment, because I think that those would be fantastic games to experience. But either way, Diamond and Pearl are going to have to stay on the Forgettable of 2022 list. At number 5, I have Multiverses. Multiverses was that free-to-play Smash Brothers clone using all of the Warner Brothers IP. You got Arya Stark from Game of Thrones fighting with Bugs Bunny against Batman. You had the Ultra Instinct Shaggy memes going up against Steven Universe. Now, this game had a massive launch, and I was part of it. I got to play in some of the closed betas. I got to play in the open betas. I was there when the game launched. I had this massive launch with over 150,000 people playing it all at the same time on Steam. We don't know how many people were playing it on consoles, but console numbers often outdo PC numbers because there's just more of them. Consoles are more accessible for people to get into. They got normally a lower baseline price. You got people gifting them to Christmas. Not many people are getting gaming PCs for Christmas, so there's normally more out there of people playing games on consoles, which is perfectly fine, but it does mean that there was probably like 500,000 people playing Multiverses at launch. I don't think that's an unreasonable estimate when there's 150,000 people playing on Steam alone. That said, I checked before making this video. This game now is scraping around the 2,000 player mark on Steam. So I'm putting it on my Forgettable list, and it seems like everyone else forgot too. Now, why is that though? This was a good designed game with really good visuals. However, you had very limited stage options. You had a very small launch roster, and that's really a painful thing for fighting games, because it's really important in fighting games for people to be able to find a character that they identify with, that they gel with, that they enjoy playing as, and oftentimes that becomes their main, and then they just play that character. Maybe they'll have a couple of side characters, so you got your main and one or two, extras on the side, but when you have such a small roster, especially in a new game, it makes it difficult for people to find that identity. They also had a lack of depth in the combat, because while we say this is a Smash Brothers clone, and it absolutely is, they didn't have some of the things that make Smash Brothers what it is for a casual audience, okay? There are no items in this game. There technically is, like, there's like Shaggy's sandwich and like a Meeseeks box, but there's literally like 2, okay? There's no items in this game that lead to weird and wacky and fun things happening at all. And the game, for the most part, is a strict 2v2 requirement. And this allowed them to do like some interesting team-based mechanics. One of the characters I played the most was Wonder Woman, and Wonder Woman, she has this ability to teleport essentially to her ally and give them both a shield that'll block the next hit that they take. And you have like Batman that's able to grapple people over to him, and Rain Dog does the same thing. And you have bonuses and buffs and stuff and movement mechanics that interact with your ally, and that's cool, but there was only 2v2. And that made for very limited gameplay when you don't have anything else that's spicing it up. You don't have crazy stages that are making, variables exist that wouldn't exist otherwise. You don't have You don't have even like a 2v2v2v2 to where like we can't let you do 4v4 because we haven't designed the mechanics for that, but you can get these big crazy brawls that happen when you have 8 players on the screen. And the stages just also, like I said, there was very few of them and they were limited in design, which meant that once you'd kind of explored that surface level of the game, there wasn't anything else. That's where it stopped. And that's really unfortunate because this game could have done really well. It had this massive, brilliant launch, and everyone's like, this feels really good. Because especially compared to the Nickelodeon one, Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl, which was like just way hyper sweaty, like trying to be a game that appealed to like professional Melee players. This game was definitely like, how much of that casual audience can we scoop up that are just not being attended by Nintendo in the Super Smash Bros. Franchise? And they're still developing for it and still putting out new characters. Like I think Marvin the Martian either just came out or is getting ready to come out. But I don't know how much of a future this game has when it went from 150,000 players down to 2,000 players, right? If it was still floating around like 10 to 25,000, those are healthier numbers, but 2,000 players are going to continue to dwindle off. And I just don't know if this game has much of a future because it just doesn't have enough depth for people to really want to fill the pool. But until like they make some sort of announcement that is some sort of overhaul about this game, about more interactive stages and injection of items, something that makes the game more than it is at its base launch, I don't even think about it in the slightest anymore. I've completely forgot about it. It's not even something that I'm like, man, I really wish Multiverses was better, right? Because I have games like that, or I was like, I really wish this game was still around. Battleborn, I haven't forgotten yet. I really wish Battleborn was still around, different conversation. But there are things with Multiverses that I'm just like, I don't know, man. I don't know what you do to fix it. Good luck, I guess. I don't know. I'm moving on to other things. So that's why Multiverses is sitting here at number 5. Number 4, as much as I don't want it to be a number 4 or on this list at all, is Nioh 2. Nioh 2 is going to be the most painful entry to talk about, okay? I really like Soulsian games. I like Dark Souls. I like Bloodborne. I like Nioh. I wanted to like Steel Rising, but the game didn't run very well, right? I'm excited to see what we get next from Software. It always feels weird to say that. I hope that Lies of P ends up being good, right? But when I look back at Nioh, and this might have kind of the same problem that Little Nightmares did, of that it's a sequel, right? And so as a sequel, how much are you an extension of the first game? How much do you set yourself apart from the first game? But when I look back at Nioh 2, I think my only memory is that game was long. That game was so long, and it is. It's super long. It's like 90 hours. It's massive, okay? But Nioh 1 is still my favorite Soulsian game. It's still above Bloodborne. It's still above Dark Souls, right? I still really adore Nioh 1. I do think Nioh 2 is better mechanically. Nioh 1 was a very rough project coming out from Team Ninja, right? Team Ninja then went on to make Nioh 2 and Stranger of Paradise. And Nioh 2, I think, looks better. I think it runs better. I think it works better mechanically than Nioh 1 does. But it just feels more bloated and more bland. It is more for the sake of being more. They added in more weapons without changing any of the old ones because they wanted them to have more weapons available. There's more enemies, but they don't feel like they're actually adding anything. It feels like the number went up without the substance actually getting deeper. You made the lake wider when you needed to dig it down. But I think it's also difficult to dig down because I feel like Nioh's combat already had a very beautiful, approachable depth to it. And if you kind of look at like Dark Souls 1 versus 2 versus 3, Dark Souls 1 is clunky and wild, right? The things that you can do in that game is weird. And then as the games get on, now this is going to be controversial, I think Dark Souls 2 is better than Dark Souls 1, and Dark Souls 3 is going to be better than Dark Souls 2, because they kept on learning and growing and improving, and newer is normally better, but sometimes older ones are loved more strongly. I know way more people that'll call Dark Souls their favorite Soulsians over Dark Souls 3, time and time and time and time again. And maybe that's where I'm sitting of like, man, I really love Nioh, and I just don't really care that much about Nioh 2. And it's going to be interesting to see where Nioh and Team Ninja go on from here, because after Nioh 2, they had Stranger of Paradise, Final Fantasy Origins, that Final Fantasy Dark Souls game. We played that, not on this list. It'll be on another one, though. Don't worry. And you know, now they're moving into Wo Long Fallen Dynasty, which looks like they're trying to kind of make a more faster-paced, action-y Nioh, which, depending on how that goes, could be really good. But whenever I look back on Soulsian games, I'm always going to be thinking about Nioh and never Nioh 2. And number 4, another one that causes me pain, is AI the Somnium Files Nirvana Initiative. And I think part of this might go into, again, that sequel category of Nioh 2 versus Nioh 1, Little Nightmares 2 versus Little Nightmare 1. AI the Somnium Files Nirvana Initiative is the sequel to AI the Somnium Files. And I feel like the sequel is overshadowed by the game that was its predecessor. The sequel is better in most ways, okay? It's got better visuals, it's got better design, it's got better mechanics, you got new mechanics. The mechanics are like engaging in a way that you didn't have in the first game. However, after playing through both games, I was really excited for Nirvana Initiative because of how much I adored AI the Somnium Files. But it felt like a lot of the charm of the first entry was lost, because we're getting introduced to these characters in the first game and going on this journey with them, and then Nirvana Initiative is the sequel, and it includes these same characters that have already went through all of these things, all of these events in the first game. I'm trying to be very vague for multiple spoiler reasons, right? And the second game, it just felt like they were trying to figure out how to take these characters another step forward. The story is a little weird and a little bit more wild than the first game, which is saying something, because the story in the first game's wild as hell, by the way. But because they wanted to go even weirder and wilder, it pulls you away from the game that makes it hard to be connected to it. The first game was deep and immersive, and you were really invested in what was happening with these characters, what was happening to them, and trying to help solve things alongside them, where because you had already achieved this journey with these characters in the first game, the second game, it felt more like the characters were telling a story to you now that you'd already finished your journey as the player. And it hurt the experience for me a lot. I don't think that the game is bad, but I don't think that it compares to the first one in the slightest. And I'll always remember the first game very, very fondly. And it does make me wonder what we will get for a third entry. If we do get a third entry, I do hope that we get one, because I like these games and I like these characters, but I have the hope that the third game is closer to the first game than the second game, while using the mechanics of the second game, because really the sequel just lost me in a way that if I ever do look back on it, it's not going to be in a fond memory. It's always going to be a bit disappointing. And if I have natural recollection of these games, I'm going to be thinking about the things I enjoyed about the first game more than the second one. And number 2, we have the Cycle Frontier. Now, this is another game that also could go in like a disappointment bin. I really, really love Escape from Tarkov, despite as many failings as that game has, despite its network issues, despite its balance issues, despite the lack of communications from its developers, despite the sheer just laundry list of problems that Escape from Tarkov has. I adore that game, and there are not games like it. And so anytime that there is a game that is akin to freaking Tarkov, whether it's the Cycle Frontier, whether it's Marauders, whether it's the DMZ mode in Escape from Tarkov 2, in Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, it catches my attention, because I'm like, man, I love Tarkov, but Tarkov is not in a state right now that I want to play it. And so I'm just like, what is the thing that can give me my fix, baby? And the Cycle Frontier, we had hoped for a long time, was going to be one of those. Now, the Cycle was a game that came out years ago that failed, and then they rebuilt that game using a lot of their assets to be an extraction shooter called the Cycle Frontier. A lot of people called it Tarkov in Space, although I think that title is much more given to Marauders at this point. Also, we saw people calling it Escape from Tarkov Light. Now, the problem is, I think this game had every opportunity in the world to be a massive success. Well, maybe not massive, but a very successful game, okay? Because the game got everyone's attention when Summit 1G played it, and everyone, and he was like, yeah, this is a very Tarkov-like game, and you should give it a try. And everyone did. Every single Tarkov streamer went out and tried it. Hunt Showdown streamers were trying it. Just shooter streamers in general were trying it. It had this massive open beta, huge attention on it. I think at one point they were like, they said that they had over 150,000 people either in the open beta or waiting to get into the open beta. Just massive amounts of people flocking to this game. And the problem is that I don't think that they were willing to listen to some of the people that were giving them feedback. There was a lot of feedback on this game, and I can understand that when you just get inundated with viewers, you're going to get this cacophony of opinions, and they're not always going to line up. It's like, who do we listen to? Do we just listen to ourselves? Do we listen to the pros? Do we listen to the casuals? How do we tell who those are? But the problem is I felt like what their answer was to just not listen to anybody and to not do anything. They received a lot of feedback, and they were like, the gun, and not all of it was even like extreme feedback. They're like, all right, your guns are a little bit unbalanced compared to armor. You need to fix that. We need a couple more options here, and we need loot to be a little bit more meaningful in these ways, in terms of them not just feeling like general items and things that we actually want to pick up and want to go for. And, you know, we're kind of hoping for some sort of economy system to really have this risk and reward feeling in this game, because if you don't have that, then what's the point of doing this extraction idea, right? And they didn't really listen to any of that, and it was really disappointing when the game reached launch, because we were like, all right, they did an open beta, they took some of that feedback, they did a little bit, they did this really big open beta, and then they got all of this feedback, and then they were like, oh yeah, and we're launching in a month, and we were like, you cannot fix these things in a month. They're like, all right, fine, 2 months, and everyone was like, okay, and then sure enough, it launched, and it didn't fix some of the issues that people expressed that it had. There were still balance issues. There was still a lack of meaningful loot and meaningful progress. And while they did try later to fix that, I think it's definitely too little too late. The player base on this game is gone. Like, they had all of these people talking about it. It was one of the most watched categories on Twitch for a while, and they just didn't capture that. They went, that's cool, and then just looked away from it. It wasn't unique enough. It wasn't enough of its own thing. It wasn't enough of like trying to be a Tarkov clone. It just didn't take its chance. Like, it built a good foundation, and then everyone said, here's some ideas of how you could carve this into something that will mean something. And then they just left it as the regular block of marble going, I don't know how we should carve it. And it just lost any sense of having a genuine identity. And it's really disappointing, because it looked good. It ran pretty good. It had a lot of ideas that they just never explored, and it didn't go hard enough in any direction to capture any of the people coming from any of the games that would have been, that it was adjacent to. It couldn't capture Battle Royale players. It couldn't capture extraction shooter players like from Escape from Tarkov, and they all just meandered off into the wind or back to whatever game they were playing. And so I don't think that this game has a future. I'm not going to remember it come a month after making this video, and instead I'm going to be going, has Tarkov fixed some of its stuff yet? Is Marauders updated to be like more of a game and not a tech demo yet? I'm going to be looking at other things rather than ever looking back on the Cycle Frontier. And at number 1, our most forgettable game of 2022 goes to V Rising. Now, part of this might be because it was a pretty early release. Games that have released earlier in the year might be more difficult to remember than games released later in the year, although I don't think anyone's having that issue with Elden Ring. And the game is actually still doing all right. It's got about 5,000 people playing it daily, compared to like the Cycle Frontier that we just talked about with about 2,500 people, Multiverse with like 2,500 people. I was looking at numbers, big surprise. Neo 2, 4,000 people playing that game right now. I'm fucking shocked, right? But anyway, V Rising is supposed to be this MMO Diablo base building style of game. This isometric action RPG. It looked really cool. You play as a vampire. You come in, you build a castle, you terrorize the local villages, you're taking down bosses. But the problem is that V Rising just kind of ended up being too much of a single player game and not enough of like an open world survival crafting game or even a multiplayer game. Because for me personally anyway, I created a server, we played on the server, I defeated all of the bosses that they had at the time, which was not a small number. There was like, how many were there? There was a lot. There was a lot of bosses. There was like 40 or something bosses. Like, I'll give them that. They had a lot of bosses. But after I'd done everything, I was like, all right, I'm done, bye. And then I just moved on with my life. And it didn't leave any type of memorable mark on me as a gamer of like something to remember. And, I did enjoy the time that I played with it, but after I played it, I was just done. And there was some balance issues. The game definitely wasn't perfect, and I'm not asking it to be, but the game didn't leave any memorable mark on me whatsoever. And the other issue is that we're getting closer to a year since this game actually launched in early access. And for this game being in early access, this game has received very, very few content updates. I went and checked like how much this game was still getting support after making this video. They've had some quality of life and like some bug fixes here and there, but in terms of content updates, nope. Nothing. There would be almost nothing for me to go do and experience again for the first time, like that would bring me back to want to play this game. And, part of that might be because I will say when I played through it, this game felt mostly done when it launched into early access. At least that's the way it felt to me. I was like, you could have probably called this 1.0 and people probably would have said, yeah, you got it. But the game doesn't have anything that makes it stand out. I don't think it stands out in a way that like makes it in any of the genres that it's trying to be, in terms of like a base building game, in terms of like a Diablo clone. There are games out there that do everything that V Rising is trying to do in a way that feels more memorable than V Rising does. That said, I can still recommend it. The game looks good, it runs good, it plays good, it's a pretty damn good game. But man, once you're done with it and once you've moved on past it, that game is just pulled out of your mind, at least it was for mine, and is just left in the wind. It just shoved back into its vampire coffin where maybe it'll rise again in however many number of years. So that closes out our most forgettable games of 2022. None of these games I necessarily feel were bad, but that's one of the reasons that I think that it's so notable that they are forgettable. Because it wasn't until I was making this list and going through my spreadsheet that I was like, I played that this year? Man, okay, I guess so. So let me know what your thoughts are. If you disagree with me, you've probably already typed a comment. I'm more than welcome to discuss these games, because in making this video, it did help me remember more about these games, but that's only an immediate thing. I guarantee you I will forget about these games to the wisps of time, given a little bit more time to pass. Next week, we'll be talking about the most memorable games I played in 2022. I will note, though, that doesn't mean that they're good or bad. They were just games that, for one reason or another, will probably stick with me for at least a few more years to come, rather than being games that I will forget in a week. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and consider subscribing to the channel. We do stream on Twitch, and I'd like to see you there. So if you do watch one of the other videos on our channel, or if I see you in the live stream, thank you and enjoy.